Well, hello, everybody. I am Julie Reed. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, currently living in State College, Pennsylvania, and teaching at at Penn State University. Uh, just it's a strange transition for me. I've only been here about a year, and a year in State College, and this is the furthest north I've ever lived, despite having a mom who's from upstate New York and a dad who's from Oklahoma. But I am sorry to not be there in person with all of you. This is one of my favorite events that I've both gotten to participate in before and also gotten to as a speaker, but also as an attendee. And so I am grateful, as always, to the Cherokee Cultural and Community Outreach team, of which many have become friends and just people I love seeing, and I get so few opportunities, and so I'm missing that opportunity right now. So I am also delighted to be here because, as I was just telling folks in our pre-meeting, that this is new material. So I'm currently working on a new book project, tentatively titled Land, Language, and Women, a Cherokee and American Educational History. And it's a long stretch of time, a long stretch of chronology. I'm starting in the archaeological record and trying to come as close to the present as I possibly can. And that's going to be tough because Cherokee educational history is rich and vibrant. And often what we spend our time thinking about is the 19th century. So we spend our time thinking about missionaries and our flourishing public school system and Sequoia's invention and how really life-changing and world-changing that was for not only literacy more broadly, but also literacy in our own community. And so I'm excited to present some of the later material from my book that I haven't had a chance to talk to a lot of folks about. So I'm grateful that you all are here, and I love at the end during our question, answer, and discussion time to hear your stories or hear additional questions that you may have, so that I can do the best job possible as I'm presenting this history of our community. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief timeline of events that I want to kind of touch on today and get our, I pretend to be a historian, and so I have to put these dates on here more for myself than for you all probably. But I just want to kind of remind us kind of where we're oriented for the purposes of my talk today. So allotment roughly ran for the Cherokees from 1898 to 1914. Statehood kind of happened in the middle of that in 1907. And of course, just as allotment is kind of wrapping up in terms of getting everybody on those rolls and including new babies born and ironing out many of the kinks that came from allotment, World War I started in 1914. A reminder, we didn't actually enter the war in the US until 1917, but that World War was raging. And then of course, at the tail end of that World War was the flu pandemic of 1918. And I am gonna spend quite a bit of time talking about that. But I also wanna orient us to other things that were happening kind of during this moment of change, that the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage were actually in the 100th anniversary of that event in 1920, although I'm going to reference some moments that, you know, suffrage was long fought for well before 1920. And so keeping in mind that suffrage is already happening in some places, even before the 19th Amendment. And then, of course, the other event that is particular to Oklahoma, or a couple events that are particular to Oklahoma that I want us to kind of keep in the backs of our minds, is that the Osage Reign of Terror, really the kind of spate of killings that are designated as the Osage Reign of Terror took place between 21 and 26. But we could actually stretch that timeline out even further on both directions. So understand that murders, suspicious murders and deaths are beginning to happen. And that the Osage weren't the only ones who experienced this. You know, that if you talk to lots of Cherokee and Creek people, there are similar kinds of stories that come from our own communities about, again, similar situations that have played out, but that weren't as highlighted the way that the Osage Reign of Terror was. And then keeping in mind that the Tulsa Race Massacre occurred in 1921, and that despite the fact we often put the Depression much later, that the Depression actually hit places like Oklahoma much earlier. And so really by the 1920s, Depression has set in Oklahoma. And I also want to talk about the aftermath of all of this. So I'm going to say a bit more about some of these, but not all of them necessarily. But I did want to give us kind of a brief timeline to work with. So allotment, just as a reminder for all of us, just that was the attempt by the federal government that began really in the 1880s, but didn't hit the Cherokees until the 1890s. The desire was on the part of federal officials and railroad interests and reformers was to break up tribally held communal lands into parcels. And typically those parcels included kind of two pieces of land. They were the homestead and the farm. And they should have been 160 acres, but there were too many Cherokees to parse out 160 acres. And so many Cherokees got much less land. So that 160 acres is the one we tend to think of, but really, in fact, in the case of the Cherokees, it was much less. And we also need to keep in mind, for those of us who kind of think about where we spend our time when we're in Oklahoma, not all of that land is farmable. There's a lot of that land that got parsed out as farmsteads or homesteads is rocky, craggy areas that are still part of mountainous regions in that area. And so not all of it is arable in the same way. And so just because you had acreage doesn't necessarily mean you could farm successfully on it. I also want to point out that another work, and a historian who I think the world of, Rose Stremlow, she wrote a family history or community history of allotment in her book called Sustaining the Cherokee Family. She is not Native, but she's a great ally and a great historian generally. And she pointed out that the policy itself and the officials tasked with carrying it out really failed to respect or care about Cherokee families who had still adhered to matrilineality and matrilocality. And so the setup of allotment was meant to distribute lands through male heads of household. But for matrilineal and matrilocal families, the heads of household were often elder women. And so the end result was that it often diminished the rights of elder women, both legally and economically, but it also forced families, it forced the sons of those elder women to sometimes act at odds with their mother's wishes and their family wishes. And so this policy was really corrosive to older family structures that many Cherokee people still abided by. And then statehood, which again occurred in 1907, one of the kind of interesting features of statehood is that they actually did a symbolic marriage ceremony to open statehood. And the marriage ceremony was between a non-Native man and a Native woman, which is kind of interesting. We have accounts of other Cherokee women talking about not going to this event and staying at home and crying because of what it meant relative to Cherokee nationhood. That this was truly not a moment that many Cherokee people celebrated, and in fact, we're silently and privately weeping over this event. And it's worth pointing out that this particular marriage ceremony is problematic in some ways because even though Cherokee governing bodies had stripped away a lot of Cherokee women's rights over the course of the 19th century, Cherokee women still possessed more property rights and rights to divorce than their female counterparts in the United States. So the idea that somehow non-Native men in a marriage often exercised more authority over their wives than Cherokee women would have had more equality and had more recourse if things went awry, that this symbolic marriage had profound implications for Cherokee women in their marriage status within the state of Oklahoma. So allotment and statehood compromised the rights of Cherokee women in a variety of ways. It aimed to subsume their economic rights through the allotment process and through the institutions that governed the state, including marriage. So throughout the 20th century, I should also add, and if you all know Jack Baker, he's one of the people who alerted me to this, and also David Cornsilk and I have talked about this, that throughout the 20th century, there were several efforts, especially by Christian ministers, to get more traditional Cherokee people to marry through the church, or at least through civil ceremonies through the state. And these efforts also ignored older marriage laws that had existed and been acknowledged under Cherokee Nation law. That were part of older ceremonies and customs related to marriage. And so this system also prevented women from more easily accessing divorce if the marriage was violent or simply unhealthy. So, and this was a right that Cherokee women had exercised for millennia. So again, all of these changes had profound implications for families who adhered to older ways of being within Cherokee society and culture, and that in some ways the Cherokee Nation had also continued to respect despite the fact that there were changing legal systems. So again, World War I ran 1914, 1918, 1917 is when the United States entered the war. Many of you probably already know this, but it's worth repeating that throughout the 20th century, Native Americans have served at higher per capita rates than any other group within the United States. So even though we make up such a small percentage of the overall population in the United States, we have served. My father, I count amongst these. I can't actually say I've served, but my dad did, and I grew up as an Air Force brat. That we've served at much higher numbers than the rest of the population, and keeping in mind that although this wasn't true of Cherokee Nation people, that many Native peoples who were serving during World War I weren't even citizens of the United States yet. This was definitely true of lots of tribes in New Mexico. And it wouldn't be until after the war, and as a result of activism on the part of many Native vets, that the 1924 Voting Rights Act for Native Americans went into place. So the other piece of World War I that I want to point out is that within my own family's oral tradition, and I suspect it's in some of yours as well, is that ceremonies at the stomp grounds were actually carried out to keep those soldiers safe while they were away at war. And at least for those Gaduas who received the ceremonies at my grounds, which is the Stokes grounds, all of them returned safely. And that to me is profound and interesting, and I think worth noting. There's going to be, I'm going to say a word about what that means for everybody to return safely when a flu pandemic is about to break out as well. And that's actually kind of our next slide. And I pulled a few quotes that I wanted to draw your attention to. All of these are either from the Tahlequah paper, and I think Claremore Progress is where I pulled all of these from. But these are just a few of the notes about the flu pandemic that came out. So one of the things we need to keep in mind is that all of those soldiers returning safely, and again, not all Cherokee soldiers returned with their lives. Many did, in fact, lose their lives. But what also came home with these soldiers was, in fact, the 1918 flu pandemic. And although the flu pandemic was erroneously referred to as the Spanish flu pandemic, a local doctor reported the first cases globally at Fort Riley in Haskell, Kansas. And of course, we know our proximity to Kansas. It's more than likely that at least some soldiers coming in and out of what was formerly Indian Territory would have passed through Fort Riley at some point. So for example, in March of 1918, there were 500 cases reported at Fort Riley. And many of those soldiers ended up shipping off to war, and that transmitted the flu more globally. And some stayed in the United States, and the flu then spread domestically as well. So as I was pulling many of these articles just to look at how the newspapers were reporting on the flu pandemic locally, one of the things that caught my attention was an article from October of 1918 from the Claremore Progress. And these articles were right next to each other, which I thought was quite fascinating. So on the right-hand side, you see that there are Spanish flu precautions. And many of them actually read similarly to kind of the precautions we're being asked to take today. But right next to that article was also an article on women's suffrage. And if you read down almost to the end of that, if you can see it, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you'll see that in Oklahoma, 356,194 women are disfranchised. And then, of course, the Claremore Progress is making a case on the part of women's suffrage. Give them a square deal. Vote for women's suffrage November 5th. So again, these are kind of both cultural and social and health issues that are preoccupying the nation during this kind of larger tumultuous time for Native peoples as beginning, even though allotment is over, this is also the period when many people are beginning to lose their lands or at least be exploited by other kinds of practices that played out around allotment. And so I want us to kind of remember that through this period, there was tremendous economic and political change happening. So a few things I want to point out, and I'm obviously reading them to you here, but unlike throughout the 19th century, there wasn't a clearly defined Cherokee governing body through which to interface with the state and federal government. Now, obviously the Gaduas were still active and still had a lot of cultural influence within the community, but there wasn't a kind of central body like a principal chief to move back and forth with the state and federal government. And of course, there were chiefs for a day throughout most of the 20th century, but we need to keep in mind the second point, that these folks were no longer democratically elected. They were selected by the executive branch of the federal government. So they weren't answerable to Cherokee people, they were answerable to the federal government. So you can imagine that it was a mixed bag in terms of whether one of those chiefs for a day would actually always operate with Cherokee people's interests at heart. The other piece we need to note is that communal land holdings, which had been a bulwark against widespread poverty, were diminished. So land is being lost at kind of neck break pace. Even though there were lots of protections in place, there were also, anybody who's read Angie DeBoe's work knows that land is being lost in a variety of ways, whether it's through illegal or immoral leases, whether it's through people believing they're signing some kinds of documents and in fact are signing others, whether it's through wardship practices with those who are deemed orphans or those adults even deemed incompetent and not able to take care of their land. So communal land holdings, even though people had attempted to maintain those lands post-allotment, the allotment didn't offer people a lot of protections. And schools, which again is the larger focus of my book right now, and which Cherokees had fought tirelessly to support and control, were no longer theirs. So 1841, one of the very first things that Cherokee officials were able to do immediately post removal, when chaos is still reigning, there's still so much political difference happening, the first thing they kind of reach agreement on in this post removal moment is the 1841 Public School Act, which set up our universal public education system. And it was followed quickly with the opening of the seminaries, and then post-Civil War we added our orphanage, which was the subject of one of the subjects of my first book. So the Cherokees were out in front on educational issues throughout most of the 19th century, and any kind of progressive program, Cherokees adopted it. Cherokees were very early adopters of kindergarten efforts. They were very early adopters of education for both men and women. And so I think, this is something that we have to keep in mind, that Cherokees, although Cherokees may have been working in schools, they were no longer running and governing schools in the same ways that they had been for the previous 100 years. And in the eyes of the United States, Cherokees were now individual citizens. They were not members of a native nation. So again, it goes back to this point that in fact, Cherokee people can't advocate for themselves collectively through a central governing body, because that central governing body doesn't exist anymore. And then I think we have to figure in these other factors. I mean, I obviously, you know, historians, we spend a lot of time thinking about the past relative to the present, and it's hard not to in certain moments. And at the same time, I think this is a moment where there's a lot of change and a lot of uncertainty, much like the moment we're in right now, but that we also have to think about what's happening more broadly nationally and also locally. So for instance, we also need to remember that Jim Crow laws are governing the lives of African descended peoples, including many African Cherokees, that they're exposed to Jim Crow laws in all of the same ways that other African descended peoples were. And just to give you a sense that between 1890 and 1957, Oklahoma Territory, followed by Oklahoma, passed 18 Jim Crow laws. And the last documented, and I use that term loosely, mob murder of an African American in Oklahoma was in 1930. So, you know, we need to keep in mind that these Jim Crow laws had profound implications in terms of education, in terms of public health, in terms of access to legal systems and voting. And these are all at play, both in Oklahoma, but also much more broadly. Immigration, which I'm going to come back to, was also of a major concern, that there was kind of new immigrants coming that gave old immigrants a lot of anxiety. And I'm going to revisit that point in a few minutes. Nativism generally, so this huge fear of outsiders or people not like us, whatever us meant. The rise of eugenics, which I'll also say a bit more about. This is the second rise of the KKK during this period. And that also, I think worth noting, is that there were significant wealth gaps between everyday Americans and those who are harnessing lots of wealth within the country. And so there were huge wealth gaps that were a precursor to some extent to the Great Depression more broadly. So I want to also to kind of stop and say, let's think about the impact of this moment on the most vulnerable Cherokee people. And I'm going to do that mainly through thinking about education and public health, because in fact, those two are pretty bound up together in this moment. I also want us to think about dominant attitudes that prevailed. And that's why I gave you some of that backdrop information on like all of these things happening: immigration concerns, the KKK, nativism, extreme wealth divides. All of this is kind of part of the anxieties that people are feeling in this moment. And also Cherokee people are being dispossessed of one of the few resources that has sustained them for millennia, the land itself. And so I want us to think about both the effects at a macro level, but also the effects at like the most local community levels. And so when I say the most vulnerable, I want to unpack kind of what I mean by that. That what I mean when in a Cherokee context is I mean those living in the most rural and isolated parts of the Cherokee Nation. And what I also mean is those families who were still bilingual and monolingual in their homes or in the larger public. One thing I will say is that the Cherokee Nation did a phenomenal job over the course of the 19th century of respecting and supporting not just bilingualism, but multilingualism. So it never denied people translators in the courts. There were always some Cherokee speaking people on council to greater or lesser degrees. There were always translators available. And so Cherokee speaking was never something that was effectively rooted out or was attempted. It wasn't that leaders even attempted that, but that's going to change significantly. And it's worth noting that at the time of statehood, 20% of Cherokee people were still Cherokee speaking. 20%. So it's still a sizable portion of the population that is Cherokee speaking. And in terms of most vulnerable people, I also mean Gaduas. I mean those who were deemed the highest blood quantum by standards imposed by the Dawes Commission. I mean African Cherokee people and Cherokee freedmen, and also Cherokee freedmen descendants. That these are many of the most vulnerable communities within a Cherokee context. And this isn't most of our families, but it is some of our families, or it is people that we can kind of quickly perhaps connect to in our own family histories. It may not have been our family's experience, but it was certainly a lot of Cherokee people's experiences. So I mentioned I was going to kind of talk a bit about education and public health, and they are really bound up together. And I'll say more about why that's the case. But I want us to take a minute to kind of think about that. Even before the flu pandemic, there were politicians and reformers and educators who were issuing calls for better public health services. And Robert L. Owen, who was a Cherokee Nation citizen and one of the first 2 senators from Oklahoma, was an ardent and early supportive of national public health policies. So he issued repeated calls for nationalized public health services free from the control of corporate America. That was one of his very big concerns, is that corporate America was preventing the ability to kind of provide services broadly and across the nation. And he, in 1910, so fully 8 years before the flu pandemic, he said this: "The physical health of the nation depends upon the prevention of epidemics, upon purity of the water supply, upon clean air, pure foods, sanitary conditions, reasonable hours of labor, protection of children and infancy from exposure." And the same year that Senator Robert Owen advocated for public health services, educational leaders with a national platform at the National Education Association, also commonly referred to today as the NEA, and this included the Bureau of Education Commissioner Elmer Brown. And he in his statements at the NEA conference that year pined about, quote, the white man's burden. And that white man's burden was that they were tasked with providing education and health services to, quote, some 30,000 natives of different backward races, Indian, Aleut, and Eskimo. So this is how national leaders are both advocating for these services, but also how they're categorizing people more broadly and thinking about the burdens that are placed on them relative to the most vulnerable populations nationally, but also, again, some of the most vulnerable populations within our own communities. And as eugenics took hold, which would later give rise to Hitler's attempts to reach human perfection through the eradication of those he deemed inferior, speakers at the NEA gave papers on, quote, subnormal pupils and those with mental retardation. And those papers often focused on how those students should be treated in the public schools. And within those groups of subnormal pupils, it included those who still operated on what they called a lower evolutionary level. And an example of those who operated on this lower evolutionary level were individuals who used, quote, the Indian method of symbolism. So throughout this decade, reformers remained preoccupied with whether schools were equipped to provide the job skills corporations like General Electric or the New York Central Railroad required. And these corporations really cared about these things regardless of the race or former nationalities of their prospective workers. They just wanted to make sure that they could continue making money through the labor force they had available to them. And reformers also wrung their hands over students' English language skills and what that might require of teachers in the classroom. And this stemmed from the fact that, and I mentioned this earlier, that the demographics of the immigrants coming to the United States was changing. So those who passed judgment also failed to recognize the irony that their families were once immigrants. And nor did it stop them from talking unironically about the nation's problem with another group who, quote, clings with pertinacity to its mother tongue, the Indians. As one speaker at the NEA conference put it, the problem of assimilating great masses of people in our country oh, sorry, the problem of assimilating great masses of people with different tongues and customs is not a new one, not even in our country, where the Indian problem still confronts us. As reformers of the early 20th century saw it, we, as Indian people, were continuing an ongoing problem. And one of those major problems was our continued engagement with bilingualism and monolingualism in Cherokee. And the problem of language in the minds of reformers was one of continued assimilation for both Indians and immigrants who were different from previous immigrants. Quote, a speaking and reading knowledge of English is one of the most effective instruments in assimilation. And as these children not only present an opportunity for the most effective work in assimilation, but are active agents in the same cause with their elders at home, it is plainly our duty to devise ways and means of bringing our language and hence our ideals within their understanding. So not only did they see reading and writing in English as an assimilative tool, they also saw children as assimilative tools to their elders, which really runs kind of counter to the relationships within our own communities between elders and young people. So additionally, there's also real concerns that are wrapped up in how who is coming to the school and what kinds of diseases they're potentially bringing with them. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this relative to Oklahoma specifically. So these concerns over public health, assimilation, and English language education converged in education reports in Oklahoma. So in 1922, classifying Indians often read like this, and you'll see these on your screen as well. They evaluated the situations of homes and those that were back in the hills or inaccessible, the condition of homes, were they log houses, were they poorly ventilated, were they overcrowded, the condition of the farm, did it have small patches of corn, how many horses did they have, how much poultry, how many hogs, how many cows, and then what were the health conditions. They worried about tuberculosis and trachoma, and they commented on that some even have a cocaine habit. And full-bloods, they specifically made this comment about full-bloods. They were markedly careless in the care of their children, and they offer no explanations of what that means. So we don't know what that actually means. Was it that they were continuing to educate children at home in the Cherokee language? Was it that their only fault was that they didn't have monetary wealth? It's unclear. And they also commented on the use of peyote as being a major problem. The same report categorized Cherokee Creeks and Choctaws in this way. So they gave 3 categories, and I'm going to go to the third one on the next slide. They described one category as the town Indians, those who send their children to town or to boarding schools, to junior colleges in nearby states, and the parents are leaders in communities. The second category was the full-bloods and many mixed bloods. And again, these are very specific classifications. They live in 2 to 4 room log houses in the country. Those houses are not well kept, they're untidy, they may be untidy, but they're not necessarily dirty. Their children may attend boarding schools or the district schools, and their parents are eager to see their children advance, but will remove kids from school for important reasons. And we can all imagine what those important reasons might be. If you're still relying heavily on farming and the farming cycle is upon you, or you have needs in a farm community, you're going to pull those kids from school potentially. And then the third category are the full-bloods or nearly so, who they described as not more advanced than so-called pagan Indian people who lived far from the paths of civilization in 1 to 3 room log homes in the hills with little furniture except for beds. And then they went on to say children of this third group are often undesirable in public schools because of the previously mentioned diseases which follow lack of cleanliness. So this is the education report from 1922. This is just 3 years after my grandmother was born, 3 years after my grandfather was born. So they're entering a public school system where this is what teachers are learning about students in the public schools or in the federal schools. available to Indian kids, that they're dirty, they're undesirable, they lack cleanliness, they're pagans, they're not even civilized. And so, so I want us to kind of take a minute to think about which group your family were in that period. Like, where would they fit? How would people categorize them? Because when I first read these reports, that's kind of where I stopped, and I thought, at that time, my great-grandmother's house was probably 1 to 3 rooms. It's in rural Vian. I don't think they had hardwood floors at that point. I think it was still a dirt floor in the home. And so, where do our families sit relative to this? And then I want us to kind of just stop and think about what are the impacts of those policies that in the wake of pandemic demonize some groups as being more prone to carrying disease or being less clean. And then what are the impacts on students when teachers nationally and locally, both Cherokee and non-Cherokee, because it's conceivable that many town Cherokees are reading these reports and adopting some of these ideas as well. What happens to those students and those families if those teachers adopt racist, nativist, and xenophobic attitudes toward the most vulnerable Native people in the community, the people that are being disenfranchised and losing land during that moment? And so, I want to end with like one of the central questions is like, how did Cherokee people overcome these obstacles and engage in Uplift? There are many of us who think that in many ways allotment was actually more devastating than removal in a couple of ways, because it economically devastated our land base, but it also, removal was an experience we experienced together by and large, versus allotment, because of the divisions that were, the whole point was to divide us up physically, and I mean, literally divide us up. That in many ways it was successful in some ways, and how people had to overcome kind of unfortunately did some of that work as well. So how did people overcome this moment? And this is the better, the more rosier view perhaps of all of this. So one of the ways that they overcame is many Cherokee people had to engage in itinerant labor. So this is probably some family stories that you all have, that in fact people had to leave the nation, went to work for the railroads, perhaps cut railroad ties a couple states away. So many men left so that their families could stay home. And the problem of Indian administration, which was a major report that came out in 1928, actually devoted an entire chapter to the migrated Indians. They also overcame through familiar institutions, which were schools and the military. So again, many Cherokee people joined the military, not only because of kind of a patriotic duty, but also because of the social safety net that it provided to their families. Cherokees understood that pensions came along with military service. They understood that there was payment that would be made for service, and so that also offered a lot of social safety net to families as well. And again, schools, getting an education, getting a job as a teacher, that also helped people. And then finally, and the one I want to spend a bit more time on is Gadugi. This idea that we are called to care and serve each other. And also in light of this year's focus on servant leadership, like I think this is the moment that we can kind of look at what are the ways that we got through this really, this moment of uncertainty. So in the Indian Pioneer Papers, there's reports of people doing for each other in all sorts of ways. And these were done in the 1930s, shortly after this period. And there were numerous people who described the sharing of farming equipment. So wheat thrashers that are mule pulled were often shared by a community, because not everybody could afford that mule thrasher or the horse pulled thrasher. Additionally, as part of the federal Indian New Deal programs, boarding school teachers were required to live within Native communities for 6 weeks during their assignments. And in the summer of 1935, Lola B. Hunt, who was assigned to Sequoia, lived in the Lion Switch community in Adair County. This is 12 miles southwest of Stillwell. And she lived with a, quote, full-blood Cherokee woman, an elderly matriarch of the old time, who still ran a little store and lived in a big house where she had reared her family and innumerable homeless children. And so I want to stop because the book, this is actually Angie Dubow's writing that I'm pulling this from, and I have the utmost respect for Angie Dubow. But in this particular account, she focuses almost exclusively on Lola B. Hunt, her husband, and an extension officer, all of whom were not Cherokee. And the woman, this matriarch from the Cherokee family, never is named. And so there's no doubt that Lola B. Hunt received an education from this Cherokee woman. And Dubow actually spells out what that curriculum entailed without actually saying it. In what I just described, Hunt learned about matrilineality, which prioritized women's economic rights. She learned about the roles and responsibilities of women to children and of both their clan kin, but also the ability of women to adopt children who were in need of care. And if these are the only curriculums that Lola Hunt mastered from this unnamed Cherokee woman, it would have been significant. But Dubow also alludes to the additional education she received as Hunt attempted to provide education of another kind. So, quote, Mrs. Hunt collected the children at the schoolhouse for recreation. She visited in the homes, walking the woodland trails, and became acquainted with the people. With Mr. Hunt, who drove out 40 miles from Sequoia School, she attended the little church. So Hunt received a well-rounded education that included the land, that included language, and it was largely facilitated by local Cherokee women. And Dubow reported in Lion Switch, quote, the public school had little influence. Its tax base was poor land dotted with tax-free allotments. The Indian children stayed away through parental indifference, language handicapped, and lack of suitable clothing and food for the noonday meal. So on the one hand, Dubow is kind of acknowledging all of this local curriculum. And on the other hand, there's also this kind of hedging her bets with describing Cherokee people's daily lives in these communities in much the same way that some of these other reports did around questions of language handicap and parental indifference, which may or may not be true. And at the same time, this is a program that was ultimately fairly successful. And I want to say that it was not only successful because it was a federally supported program and that there were ally employees within that system like the Hunt family. They were also successful because of the unknown servants in the community, this unnamed Cherokee matriarch. And so I cite these two examples, the kind of sharing of equipment, but also taking people in to live in your home and introducing them to the community so that they can better accomplish the mission that they have in the community. I cite these examples, and these are only two among many more ways in this moment of uncertainty that in fact should inspire us perhaps to be, how do we be good allies to each other? How can we be good neighbors? And finally, who are our silent pillars who are in our communities teaching others so that they can better obtain the goals and missions that they set out to do? So who's silently supporting us that's never going to get named in the record, but in fact are always in the backdrop, protecting, educating, and doing what's asked of us in moments of severe crisis. So I'm going to let you see my kind of works cited page. And now with the time remaining, I do want to take questions or hear comments from all of you. I realize I won't actually be able to hear them, but you'll be able to use the chat to offer some of those. So any questions or comments, or I'd love to, if you're a better chat writer than I am, kind of offering up of stories. So yeah, as I said, this is to Larry, as I said in the opening, I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. My family still lives some in Vian, some in Tahlequah, some in Norman. Yeah, I've got lots of folks back there still living and working in Oklahoma. My dad grew up in Vian until he was in middle school and then moved to Norman. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, so somebody actually asked for me to kind of speak to the Jim Crow laws of the period. So thanks, Brian. um, so the Jim Crow laws in particular, often included a variety of different kind of either barriers or outright racism that prevented African Americans from fully accessing the rights of citizenship. And so you'll note, perhaps some of you had a chance to kind of read more closely or could see it more closely, that even in that suffrage article that from the Claremore Progress, it made a point of saying that women who wanted to vote actually had to pay poll taxes. So that was one way to create a barrier for both women very early on, but also African Americans that extended much longer into the future. So requiring people to pay poll taxes, literacy tests in order to determine whether in fact you could read and write and therefore were educated enough to be a participant. As an aside, there's a group of us, I'm an alum of UNC Chapel Hill. There's a group of us currently trying to get a building renamed after Henry Owl, who is Eastern Band and was the first non-white student to attend UNC Chapel Hill. He had a master's degree from UNC Chapel Hill. He had an undergraduate degree from Lenoir-Rhyne. He was a veteran of World War I, and there were attempts made in North Carolina to keep him from voting using literacy tests. And so it was kind of at the discretion of local people to determine whether in fact somebody was literate or not. It also included segregated public services. So I'm currently working my way through The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And so that book kind of recounts the ways that Johns Hopkins Hospital was one of the few hospitals that actually allowed African-American people to receive services there. And of course, all of the facilities were segregated. They couldn't enter the same entrances to the hospitals. And of course, lots of hospitals just didn't serve African-American patients. So there's also an irony there that on the one hand, and I didn't include this, but there are some parts of the report that describe African-Americans in education, in Oklahoma education reports, in almost the exact same ways that they're describing Cherokee children and Cherokee families. And so there's an irony to not giving people access to the care that they need and then blaming them for unhealthy living conditions or being sick. That the cruelties of that are pretty compounding in any moment. So, I think there were other, obviously the residuals of some of these things were like sundown towns where people were actually mourned out of communities after sundown. I can give you some stats too on kind of how things played out in terms of, KKK in Oklahoma, because it really, and I would say this is not only true of Oklahoma, but true more broadly. Between 1921 and 1924, there were 102 floggings. Reports of mass action were 21. There were 3 killings. 1 person was burned. There were 24 beatings, and there were 3 cases of tarring and feathering. So, this is also part and parcel of that, is both, that in fact, it's not just about the kind of public actions and state ways that people are denied access, but also the fear that people operate under in those larger systems that are meant to curtail their efforts. Okay, I got asked, how do we bridge the gap between the ones with their citizenship and the ones who have discovered their lineage and trying to obtain citizenship? So, I think this is fascinating, right? That like, I think about and there's another question about matrilineality as well, that until 1825, when Cherokee Nation passed a law that said that that Cherokee men could produce Cherokee citizens, that up until that point you weren't Cherokee if your mother wasn't Cherokee. So pre-1825, had I been born, I wouldn't have been Cherokee, because it's my dad that's Cherokee, not my mother. And so I think we have to think about the ways that who we conceive of as being part of our community changes over time. And that's no less true of Cherokee people, that there have been different ways of conceiving who we are as a people that have changed over time. And so I think that's one way to think about it. So, okay, those people, my first book kind of highlights Walter Adair Duncan, who becomes a citizen of the Cherokee Nation as a result of that 1825 law. But 55 years later, and don't get me wrong, I love Walter Adair Duncan. That man is an unsung hero in a whole host of ways relative to social welfare and education. But post Civil War, he wasn't an advocate for freedmen who became citizens. In fact, he worked against them at times. And so there's a way in which, sure, I'm quarterbacking, but there's a way in which he received citizenship as a result of changing laws, and so did the descendants of freedmen and freedmen. And yet there wasn't the kind of creative ability to think through how do we make room and also think about those folks as being vulnerable, perhaps. And so I think we have to think about, like, what are the ways in which citizenship, yes, invites people in, but what are the barriers still in place to fully accessing the rights of that citizenship? And so, you know, I will say Cherokee Cultural and Community Outreach does a fantastic job of reaching out to people who perhaps, as a result of this itinerancy that I talked about earlier, people who had to leave Oklahoma so that other members could stay. And so this particular, the idea of our satellite communities and reaching out to people, I think, does a phenomenal job of connecting us all back together, who, as a result of perhaps this moment, unfortunately pulled us apart. And so there again, this maybe isn't the only way to invite people into citizenship, but it is one way. And I think there's probably lots of other creative ways to do so, even beyond voting rights, but that also we should think about what are our responsibilities as a result of that. What are our responsibilities in terms of citizenship? Who are we accountable to within the jurisdictional area, or vice versa? Like, how do we stay accountable to those folks, the people who stayed behind? Sorry, I'm reading questions real quick. And I've got my 5-minute warning. I'm now down to 2 minutes. Okay, so Monty, so you're asking, did matrilineality partly get resolved? I'm assuming you're asking relative to the 20th century, but if I may get that wrong. And of course, Monty, you know, you can always email me and ask me additional questions. Monty's one of those people I miss seeing in person. So I think that communally, we have always acknowledged matrilineality, and that there have been a variety of ways that Cherokee people have worked to validate those systems, at least at the local level. Like, it's much harder in terms of state and federal systems getting acknowledgement of those other systems and ways of being. So, you know, I think not marrying, perhaps, within the church was one perhaps part of resistance, but also one way that it didn't stop community members necessarily from recognizing that those people were married, just not in the ways perhaps that society would, that the larger society, the state and the larger US would acknowledge. And I think, you know, in our own families more generally, we have to think about, like, who are the people we look to as the core of our families. It's often our grandmothers and our aunties. you know, that there's that one female family member that we look to as being kind of a guiding force. So again, I think very informally, we do respect and acknowledge matrilineality. You know, I think we also have to work harder if we're, you know, when we give lip service to like being more traditional or thinking about our traditional ways, that in fact, I keep waiting for somebody to say we're bringing back the women's councils, but I haven't heard that yet. I keep hoping, but that hasn't happened yet. So I think there's still other kinds of creative ways that we can do that. So thanks for the question, Monty. And again, if I didn't quite answer what you were asking, you know, please email me or send me a text. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm kind of at my time at this point. Hopefully all of you can see my information in the larger CVent pieces, and you absolutely can feel free to reach out to me by email at Penn State. And I hope that some of you do, especially if some of you have these stories of itinerancy or have I know in my own family, kind of public health stories. I'd love to hear them. And so please, if you're willing, share those stories with me. I'm still working on this current book project and want to hear about all of the formal and informal ways that education continued to play out in our communities. So I want to, again, thank you to you all. Thank you to the Cultural Community Outreach team for including me again this year. I appreciate it. Wado.